welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and welcome to the very first video sort of the new year, which will be a book review for The Birthday of the World and Other Stories written by Ursula K. Le Guin. In case you're new here, I will get this out of the way straight away. I am a big Ursula K. Le Guin fan, and I've already done several other book reviews for some of her other works, including some of her best known, like The Left Hand of Darkness, which is one of my favorite science fiction novels of all time. This, however, is a short story collection I first read about 12 years ago now, so I wanted to reread this year to see if I felt differently about it. I first read this on a school trip, funnily enough, and this time around I also read this on a trip/vacation, and I'm very, very happy to report that this is indeed still my favorite short story collection by Ursula K. Le Guin, and, well, one of my favorite pieces of writing by Ursula K. Le Guin, period. As this is a short story collection, and as I've already done other reviews for works by Le Guin, I'm going to breeze through the writing section and the character work section and the world building section somewhat, and really go more in depth for each individual story within the collection. But so first, a quick note on the writing. You can refer back to what I've said in other reviews for works by Le Guin, but I just like her writing. I find it's just this perfect blend of straightforwardness and more lyrical writing and use of imagery. It's just something I know, very comfortable about it, very cozy. I just feel like I'm, in a way, coming home every time I go into a story written by Ursula K. Le Guin, especially if it's her science fiction. Character work-wise, I don't think the main point of this collection is to really go deeply into developing individual characters, though this is definitely concerned with human character in a broader sense, human nature, what it means to be a human being, to be a person. That is very important to a lot of the thematic developments of the stories present in this collection. That being said, I thought there was still a lot of emotion conveyed by some of the main characters present in these stories, but it's not the main point of this collection, really. It's not the focus, and I really didn't mind. However, if you are a more forcefully character-driven reader, you might feel like this is a bit lacking, I suppose, in this collection, though I would argue it's generally something a bit more lacking in short fiction generally, but I don't necessarily mind, since this is not what I'm looking for when I go into something like this. I will say, however, her handling of human psychology, human emotionality is superb, in my opinion, and, I mean, to me it is one of her signatures as a science fiction or more generally SFF writer. World-building wise, most of the stories in this collection take place in Le Guin's universe of the Ecumen being this coalition of worlds centering around the collection, gathering and spreading of knowledge and exchanging information. It's not so much a political organization, though sometimes there is political meddling because human beings, am I right? And those human beings all descend from an original genetic stock heralding from the planet Hain, even Terran. So Earth exists in this universe, but the people of Earth are actually descended from the Hainish. The Hainish are the original humans who arose through evolution millions of years ago, and they've colonized various different planets, and then afterwards have messed with the genetics of people on different planets. So it's all people by human beings. There aren't any extraterrestrials in the world of the Ecumen. However, there are human beings that have been somewhat genetically modified, like the Gathenian, which you read about in The Left Hand of Darkness, which are human beings that are hermaphroditic, sequentially hermaphroditic. They can be male or female during their estrus periods in a way, and you have other such modifications on different planets, though the variety in the Ecumen really boils down to the cultural variations. Now, these being short stories, you're not gonna get a ton of world building for everyone. However, I always felt the settings were real enough to me. I could really let myself be immersed in them. It also helps that some of the stories in this collection link back to other stories she's written taking place on the same worlds. There's the planet O, which features in two of the stories in this collection, but the planet O features in its own story story collection as well. There are the planets Werrel and Yoe, which you find here, but there's also a separate story collection dealing entirely with that planet. There's, of course, Gethen or Winter, which you find in the Left Hand of Darkness, but there's a story in here dealing with the people of that planet. So if you've read those, if you're a Le Guin fan, then you'll have at the back of your mind additional world-building elements, which definitely helps. But still, on its own, I still think you get enough elements to feel those worlds are real and convincing and all that good stuff. So there are 8 stories in this collection, 6 of which do take place in this universe of the Ecumen. The 7th one might take place in the Ecumen, is how Le Guin puts it in her introduction. The 8th, however, takes place in our version of reality on a generation ship. The first story in the collection is called Coming of Age in Karhide. Karhide being a location on the planet Gethen, the location of the novel The Left Hand of Darkness. And this story takes a closer look at the sexual lives and the sexual coming of age, more specifically, of a Gethenian. And the Gethenians are interesting because they live most of the time in this neutral sexual state. They're neither fully female, neither fully male. However, every month they go through an intense period of estrus, is what I would call it, and they fully develop into male or female. And so every Gethenian, except some individuals, experiences life at some point as a man or a woman, and they do not have gender in their society as a result. And this is talked about a lot in The Left Hand of Darkness, but here Le Guin wanted to take a close look at the sexual practicalities of this. And so she follows a main character who goes through puberty, basically, and through their first phase of Kema. Kema being this period of estrus, during which you're either fully a man or fully a woman. It's quite a nice, light-hearted story. I mean, it deals with interesting ideas around gender, sexuality, coming of age, becoming an adult, a sexual adult, and taking a look at the important place sex and sexuality has in our lives as, animals, as adult animals. But it has quite a light-hearted tone to it that I appreciated, and it just gives you added world-building for Gethen and just continues that general theming around gender and sexuality, which I loved in The Left Hand of Darkness. Then there is the story The Matter of Seggri. This starts out as an envoy from the Ecumen, stabile or immobile. At first it's an exploratory team coming to this planet Seggri to observe how humans function on it. Then there are further developments as the Ecumen gets into more official contact with that civilization. Seggri is interesting because sometime in the very distant past, the Hainish messed about the genetics of the humans on the planet and made it so that 1 out of 16 births, viable births, is male and the rest are all female. So there's this ginormous sex ratio imbalance on the planet. There's so many more women than there are men. And this led to a very particular social organization. It's reminiscent, in a way, of the abusive power structures of patriarchy, but it's not quite matriarchy either. It's just that men are kind of contained in these compounds, in these cities around a castle, and the women basically run society outside of that. And you see how everyone in that society upholds the system and thinks it's the right system. At first, you have this male envoy from the Ecumen who thinks that men hold the power because they are showered in prestige. They have these fights, these dances, very competitive, and then the winners get to service women in these fuckeries, have sex with them, impregnate them. And so they think the men have it easy, they have the good life. But in fact, women run industry. They are the intellectuals. They run the universities. They are freer than the men. So the men have privilege, but the women have all the power. So it's an interesting system. It's not quite matriarchal as such. It's not patriarchal, but it's definitely unfair and heavily sex segregated because of this weird imbalance when it comes to live births. And so you see how these people on Seggri conceptualize gender and the proper place of men and women. Women do have sex with men for pleasure, and they do seek the sexual services of men to get pregnant, but in their daily lives, they relate to each other as women. Lesbianism is kind of the default, or bisexuality is the default. Women get into couples with other women, or even thruples, for love and emotional intimacy, but they might still go to a fuckery to have sex with a man. And so love is seen as something men can't experience, and there's a lot of disparaging comments about men. But at the same time, the women really get into the competitive sports aspect aspect of the males and they support their local city teams. And everyone just participates in the system and doesn't really question it until some developments. And then you have this fight for gender equality, to educate men, to allow them to live outside these compounds where you discover they live very harsh lives, ultra competitive, kind of reminiscent of some of the stuff I read about all-male boarding schools, and a lot of sexual violence between the men. So there's a lot of toxic masculinity exposed as well, but they don't really have a choice. It's interesting because it blends these ideas of like some of perhaps the intrinsic differences between men and women when it comes to hormones, aggression, but then you see all this gender system built around it, which is made out of air in a way, though it was made up because that's how they adapted to this weird sex ratio. So it just deals with gender and sex in a very interesting way, in a very clever and nuanced way, as Ursula K. Le Guin always does, really. But I don't know, I really vibe deeply with this story in particular. So that's probably one of my favorites in the collection, if not my favorite, because of the way it just asks questions about sex, gender, what is biological, what is made up and societal, how you can easily flip power dynamics and see, no, women should be in charge of intellectual pursuits, industry, men are just good for fighting amongst themselves and getting us pregnant, and all these questions that arise out of that. So, absolutely brilliant short story. The two next stories take place on the planet O. They're called Unchosen Love and Mountain Ways. Now, the interesting thing about the planet O is that on that planet, human beings are divided into two moieties, which basically means a half. So this grouping of people, we have the morning people and the evening people. Morning people cannot have sexual relations with other morning people, and sleeping with someone of your moiety is considered incest. Another interesting thing about the planet O is that people marry in groups of 4, 2 men and 2 women. You have one heterosexual relationship in that group, one male homosexual relationship and one female homosexual relationship, and then there are 2 people in that group who cannot have sex because they belong to the same moiety. So these 2 stories are quite different in tone. The first one is more about a man who falls in love with another man from this fishing village. He's not sure he wants to settle down with him. If he wants to settle down with him, he'll have to include 2 women into a marriage, also called a sidoretu, and he's just really interested in his gay male relationship to his lover. The second story, Mountain Ways, is more slightly a bit of a comedy of manners in a way. There's playing around with cross-dressing and addressing questions of gender within a 4-person marriage, including heterosexual and homosexual relationships. So that was really cool. Ultimately, it just deals with humans' difficulties when it comes to love and intimate relationships. It takes a strange form because marriages are between 4 people. But then you have like someone from another planet coming to O and wondering about, why do you make it so complicated? But they're like, is it so much simpler between 2 people? Not necessarily. It's just at the end of the day, we're all human beings trying to figure shit out when it comes to our feelings. So I really like that. And there was some lovely, lovely writing about love, about spirituality, about the spiritual aspects of love, which I really vibed with. It also deals with jealousy, of course, and just trying to make the best of these very old social institutions, one of which being marriage. It's just that here marriage is a bit more complex, I guess, than it is here on Earth, or at least in some cultures on Earth. And there is actually a short story collection entirely devoted to the planet O. It's called A Fisherman of the Inland Sea. However, I first read this collection before the other one, and I still really prefer this one and the stories about O in this collection. The 5th story is called Solitude, and that's also probably one of my favorites, if not my actual favorite. It's kind of a toss-up between that one and the Matter of Seggri, though I also really enjoyed this time around Paradise Lost, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Solitude is just so thought-provoking. It's quite serious in tone. It's not lighthearted at all. It deals with just these deep questions about what it means to be a person, what it means to be an individual, relating to society around you. Also deals with sex and gender to a slightly lesser extent. Solitude takes a look at these 2, this one female envoy from the Ecumen goes to the planet, I can't remember the name of the planet, let's call it Solitude, the planet Solitude, and she goes there with her 2 children because she's taking this immersive anthropologist approach of just living among the natives, taking notes and trying to make sense of the data she's gathering. The children, however, are raised as natives, especially her little girl, because her boy is somewhat older, and then he ends up leaving that planet because life for males on that planet is really harsh. So this planet went through a massive civilizational collapse, however many centuries ago. The planet grew in human population to just insane numbers, like 100 billion or something. And, well, overpopulation, there's definitely a comment about overpopulation in the story, which I loved, led to depletion of resources. There were horrible, hierarchical, abusive power structures, and civilization collapsed, quite simply. As a result, the few remaining humans who survived throughout the centuries developed this culture where they really prize, I'm not sure introversion is really the right word, but being alone, not gathering in great groups, relying primarily on yourself, and not invading other people's private spaces. Now, at the time when I first read this, I strongly vibed with it because being a loner, being highly introverted, now knowing I'm also actually on the spectrum, it just spoke to me. I was like, that sounds somewhat appealing. I mean, not entirely. I think this is really an extreme version of functioning like that, which I wouldn't necessarily want for myself, but it just asks these questions about desiring solitude, finding meaning, inner fulfillment on your own without anyone else around you. Yet there are still relationships, there's still love in this society. Women take care of children, raise them, but then as adults, they'll never visit each other at their houses. They might relate whilst they're gardening, whilst they're in a singing circle or a kind of spiritual prayer circle. They might go traveling together. Men and women relate as well. Women might make love to men in a hut to the side and they might frequent them many times over the years, but they'll never move in together. And men have a much harsher lot on this planet. It's also very competitive. You have a group of men who kind of defend the aunts villages is what they're called. But then you have more feral bands of young men who try to establish themselves. There's almost a very primal animal aspect of the way the society is organized. But it's not quite tribal either. It's just very interesting. It again plays around with the ideas of what exactly makes women and men different, if anything. What is a part of social education and gender, and then how do you relate that back to a society who chooses to value individuality and personhood? And so the people on this planet don't use the word people. People is something bad. They use the word persons. Everyone is a person. Many persons are persons, not people. People is just a bad word. And then they also think that technology is magic because of the way they've mythologized their very distant past. It's just such a thoughtful story. I can't stress this enough. It just makes you think. It makes you feel, sometimes perhaps a bit uncomfortable, even for someone like me who is highly introverted and solitary, but still, I'd rather live with my significant other than be completely isolated in a hut, though at times I've found that idea attractive as well. So it's just pure, beautiful, sublime brain food for me. So love that story. If nothing else, even if you just don't agree with the fundamental premise, it will make you think about these deeper questions. Then story number 7 is called All Music and the Slave Women. So this is a story that takes place on the world of either Werrell or Yeoe. These planets are related through culture and races, and you get more stories set in those worlds in the story collection For Ways to Forgiveness. This is kind of a 5th act to that collection, though once again I first read this before For Ways to Forgiveness, though I really enjoyed For Ways to Forgiveness. Well, enjoyed it. It deals with slavery, racism, structural oppression, so it's quite heavy stuff, but it was very engaging. So here it also deals a lot with slavery, racism, not in the way you're used to on planet Earth. Here, I think everyone is... No, I think the oppressors are dark-skinned, and they also have these very, black eyes, and the lighter you are, the more garbage you're deemed to be, and there's something to do with eye color as well. And then you have this guy from Hain, from the Ecumen, who's just completely unrelated to the genetics of these peoples, and he gets kidnapped, and he gets interrogated by the main power because there's been an uprising of the slaves, and he's just kind of trying to observe and gather information, though he is on the side of the slaves because the Ecumen does not agree with slavery, and so they issue warnings to the government of this planet, etc., etc. It talks about slavery, the things it does to your psyche, how complex it can actually be, how nuanced. It doesn't say that slavery is good in the slightest, but it deals with uncomfortable questions and ideas such as some slaves actually wanted to stay slaves because it was safer for them, or it felt more familiar. It doesn't justify slavery, but it just goes to show that human psyche can be quite complex and strongly affected by trauma and being used to a way of life and never having known anything else. It also touches upon the corruption of ideals, idealism through power, because power does tend to corrupt. You see the leaders of the rebellion movement not wanting to compromise and putting people in danger, and then some of the slaves who are leaders of the movement look down upon the slaves who didn't want to participate, who just wanted to stay on their sort of plantation and keep living their lives because they thought it wasn't that bad ultimately, and they'd just been brainwashed into thinking that was the right way of life for them. And it's quite tragic at times. There's something very sad in this story. It's just so beautifully nuanced and rich in the way it approached this topic, though it doesn't delve that deeply into it either, because it is a short story and you'll get more of that specific context in For Ways to Forgiveness. The next story I honestly didn't care for that much at all. It's probably my least favorite of the collection. It is the title story, The Birthday of the World. According to Sir Caleb Wynne, it might take place in the Ecumen or not. You have this society that is very reminiscent of ancient Peru and the ancient Inca. You have basically this royal family, brothers and sisters marry, and they incarnate the divine. They become God when they marry each other, and you have the female face of God and the male face of God. And there's prophecy involved, and then something goes very wrong at one of the festivals where God is supposed to see into the future, and they see something bad. They see end of the world stuff, and it kind of goes on from there and leads to the dissolution of the society and its way of life. And it's told through the point of view of the daughter of God, who becomes God herself for a while because she's like the female heir of the divine monarchy, and she just kind of recounts the ending of her world, of her civilization. I enjoyed it enough for what it was. I just felt I got less out of it than the other stories. So it deals with change, the passage of time, the passing of ages, things like that, but less meaty for me than the other stories in this collection. And finally, the very last story in this collection, Paradise Lost, which takes place in our version of reality according to the author. This is a generation ship story. Some humans have decided to send a ship out into space to colonize this planet they found, though they're not even entirely sure they can colonize it, but they took a shot in the dark and sent out these people. They think it will take them 200 and something years to get there, and they're like 5 generations born on this ship, or 4. Then it turns out it will actually take them less time to get to the destination planet than they originally thought. You start the story at like generation 3 and 4. So these are people who've never known Earth. They were born, lived, and some of them die on this ship. And you see how that works, how human society structures itself in such a specific environment, a contained environment, closed environment really. You follow these 2 main characters, especially a female character of Asian descent and a male character who is her childhood best friend, even love in a way, I would argue, soulmate kind of relationship, who is of mixed European, North American descent, whatever. Because, I mean, descent somewhat matters to the story. It's an interesting little world-building device. And it also deals with, again, sex, relationships, love. The way people handle reproduction is very interesting because they have to keep their population stable throughout these generations. So, for example, men can have 1 child and women can have 1 child. But a man needs to find a woman to carry his child. And there's this whole commentary about the burdens of reproduction placed on women, but then there are also homosexual people, some people who don't want children at all, so that means that sometimes some people can have 1 extra child, some people live together, some people don't, there are these family units. Then you see how education works, how the rearing of children works, and then there's this whole plot with religion, because some people start believing that the destination isn't the point, that they should keep going into space because this will take them to a state of bliss and communion with the divine. And there's a commentary about religion and how these people descend from, the Christians, the Muslims, the monotheists, and some people find that ridiculous. And then there's this conflict between the people who want to get to the destination planet, which was the whole bloody point of the whole enterprise, and the people who want to keep going into space. And they start manipulating education and historical material. I don't know, it was just this fascinating story about this closed environment and what it does to human beings, really. You get some of that as well in Children of Time, though that was really more centered on actual trauma and horror. Here it's not necessarily horrible, because people have found a way to function along the centuries. First time around, I really didn't appreciate the story as much, but now it's honestly probably in the top 3 of my favorite stories in this collection, or maybe I'd place it at the same level as Coming of Age and Karhide, because I just vibe with the whole Gethin Left Hand of Darkness stuff. But it's just a very, very good story, an excellent generation ship story. So yeah, I'm happy I enjoyed it so much more this time around. So generally, as you can see, thematically, it's just classic Le Guin. It deals with gender, sexuality, racism, oppressive hierarchical power structures, what it means to be human, emotions, spirituality, religion, all that very thoughtful, delicious stuff that I tend to avidly snack on. So it was such a great pleasure for me to go through this collection again. I look forward to dipping back into it sometime in the future. Great reading experience. I would definitely highly recommend it if you like very thoughtful science fiction of a more sociological, anthropological bent. And if you're an Ursula K. Le Guin fan and haven't yet gotten to this collection, then what are you waiting for? I hope you found this review interesting. If you want to share any thoughts about this collection or about Le Guin's writing more generally, please feel free to do so. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. And I shall see you all reasonably soon in the next video. Bye-bye!